delivered to the camera sensor in the corners of the frame compared to the middle. So you end up with slightly darker corners. We had an area under the lens corrections area that was designed to compensate for it. Let's go look at that area first. Under lens corrections, when I go to profile, if I turn on the checkbox to enable those, it's going to compensate for vignetting and distortion. You notice the image shifted a bit. Before, I could see that this line here bowed downward just a little bit in the image due to the distortion of my lens. When I turn this on, it becomes a little bit more straight, just like a fisheye lens, but to a lesser extent. It corrected for that. But then if you watch the corners of the frame, and I turn the same checkbox off and back on, do you see the corners getting brighter? That's trying to compensate for any unevenness in brightness, and I can control that here with a slider called vignetting. If I turn it down, I can tell it to not compensate as much, and it'll keep those corners a little bit darker. Or I can move it the opposite direction and try to somewhat overcompensate and brighten it even more, just in case it didn't do enough for my lens. There's also a choice under the manual tab where we corrected for tilting our camera up for vignetting, and that's if your lens is not included in the database, meaning if you go over here to profile and you turn this on and it can't find out what your lens is, or it's never tested it so it doesn't show up, you could manually correct for it by going to the manual tab. And then down here I have a mount. If I bring it up, it's going to brighten. If I bring it down, it's going to darken. And I could try to compensate for it there. Well, Adobe put that in originally before they came up with the concept of having profiles for your lenses, where it would do it all automatically. Instead, originally they had it where we could manually compensate for it. And they noticed that a lot of people, instead of turning it up to brighten the corners and compensate for them being a little darker, they would do the opposite. They would bring it down into a negative range to darken the edges. And then there's this setting called midpoint, which tells it how far it can encroach into the image towards the center of the frame. And that could be an effective way of directing attention towards the middle of the frame, because the middle of the frame would then be the brightest part of the picture, and as you got away from the middle, it would get darker. Your eye is usually drawn to the brighter areas, and therefore you keep your attention near the middle. And so a lot of people were doing that when that feature was really designed for compensating for your lens, whereas this would be making your lens worse, making the corners even darker. The problem, though, having that and being able to put it into a negative range is what if you crop your photograph? If you crop your photograph, these sliders always think about the original cropping because they're designed originally for correcting for, compensating for your lens, and your lens would always be the corners of the original framing. So if I crop this image into a horizontal picture, it would be thinking about the original corners. When it darkens, it wouldn't think about my new cropping. So let's go to the crop tool. Let's come in here and crop this into a horizontal image or a square one, whatever we decide we want. Looks like a little bit crooked, so when I'm in that manual area of lens corrections, I can rotate. Okay. And then, now if I'm going to try to do my lens vignetting, I'll see if I can leave the cropping there so you can see the original corners of the image. If I really want to draw your attention to the middle by darkening the edges, now this thing called lens vignetting isn't going to be as helpful, because you see where it's darkening? It's over where the original corners of the image were, and so it's barely getting into this area at all. So because of that, Adobe noticed that a lot of people were using it to darken the edges, but they would crop their pictures, and in doing so, it would not be darkening the right area. So they added something. Instead of being under lens corrections, which is literally there to deal with problems caused by your lens, you can go down to effects, and that's where you find post-crop vignetting, which means don't think about the original framing in the picture, think about what we have right now. And therefore here we have an amount setting. You can bring it down and notice that now it's darkening the edges based on this new cropping, not based on the original. Before I get into the settings of this, do we have a question?
Just step back half a step to
Sure.
the